Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science, and welcome back to our series of POMEPS conversations with leading scholars of the Middle East. With me today is Jason Brownlee, who is a professor of political science at the University of Texas, Austin, and the author of a recent book, Democracy Prevention, the Politics of the U.S. Egyptian Alliance, with Cambridge University Press, and someone who's been writing for many years about the U.S. role in democracy, democratic transitions, the logic of authoritarianism, and many other topics. So welcome, Jason.
Oh, thanks.
Welcome to Washington. So I thought a good place to start would be to talk about the book itself and your argument that the United States, rather than being a force for promoting democracy, has actually been a force for retarding democracy, at least in the Middle East. Could you tell us a little bit about your reasoning for that and why you think that's the case?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, one of the things to recognize is that in political science, we have a lot of work that talks about democracy promotion and the U.S. being on the opposition side in fighting against authoritarianism. And so, for example, we have studies that have recently looked at the so-called color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, in which the U.S. provided assistance to NGOs and activists that were struggling against non-democratic regimes. And we have a great book on that topic, Competitive Authoritarianism by Steve Levitsky and Lucan Way, that talks about all kinds of efforts that the U.S. made to promote democracy during the post-Cold War era. What we don't have, at least not recently, and especially not for the post-Cold War period, are studies that look at the flip side of that, when the U.S. operates as a so-called black knight, supporting authoritarianism rather than supporting democracy. And certainly that has been the experience that Egyptians have seen over the past decades, and it's one that Egyptians have written a lot about, and it's what drew my attention to this problem and got me interested in writing the book.
Well, but let me ask you about that, because I think most people who are not, ideologues on the question of democracy would look at the Middle East and say, well, of course, the United States has interests in the Middle East. Why wouldn't it support authoritarianism? I mean, what's new about the argument that the U.S. is not, avidly supporting real democratization in the Middle East?
Well, when we get into discussions of U.S. policy, let's say in Egypt, and there's talk of democracy promotion, people often focus on economic aid or political conditionality, and they think about what sort of levers and switches U.S. policymakers could turn or flip in order to make things more democratic in Egypt. And let's say during the George W. Bush administration, people talked about how Bush pressured Mubarak to, say, introduce multi-candidate presidential elections. And what I'm trying to say in the book is that there's actually a whole host of ways in which the U.S. has participated on the other side and done far more and invested far more resources in keeping the regime in power and keeping it going. Tens of billions of dollars in military aid, for example, and all kinds of military support and intelligence collaboration. And so that aspect of politics, while perhaps non-controversial if you raise it explicitly in some circles, is not something that we've systematically looked at, and we don't have close analysis of it. And sometimes when I've been in discussions about democracy promotion and I raised it, people looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language.
Well, it's true that in Washington, as you point out, there's this ideology that we are in favor of democracy. But I mean, you look at the record, though, and look at logic. Why would you expect the United States to want democracy in places like the Gulf or places like Egypt, where they get what they want from non-democratic systems? In other words, the puzzle here. Why is this something which is not, self-evident?
Right. Well, one of the reasons why it hasn't been as self-evident as we might think is that we have a tremendous amount of rhetoric and actually academic work by political scientists that talk about democracy promotion. And so one of the things that we need to do, whether we're political scientists or just observers of politics, is to compare the words with the deeds and do that in a careful way. And so that's one of the aspects here that I'm looking at. Another thing in terms of the puzzle is to consider the ways in which authoritarianism is not just a domestic phenomenon, but actually is an international or transnational phenomenon that can be co-constituted by multiple actors, some of whom are in electoral democracies and others of whom are in autocracies.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You put quite a bit of weight on the U.S. role in supporting these autocracies, but how important do you think the United States really is as opposed to domestic factors, domestic resources, domestic coalitions? Now, how much weight would you put analytically on external roles versus internal in terms of supporting authoritarianism?
Well, I would say that there are specific ways in which external forces can help authoritarian leaders to stay in power longer than they otherwise might. And I talk about these mechanisms in which authoritarianism can be reproduced. And one of the ways is through economic assistance that prevents a crisis, a serious crisis that would eject the ruler. So, for example, in the 1990s, both Egypt and Indonesia had very serious economic problems. Egypt, around the time of the Gulf War, benefited from a tremendous bailout and debt relief, which essentially rescued Mubarak during that decade from the fate that President Suharto suffered in Indonesia.
But Mubarak was useful, right? He was supporting us in creating an Arab coalition to liberate Kuwait.
Right.
So
yeah.
why isn't that just a straightforward transaction?
He had a geostrategic role in the post-Cold War era, a sort of importance for U.S. policymakers that Suharto did not retain. Another way is in preventing
to go back to your earlier book, though, you look at like the Philippines, where Reagan makes a very interesting decision to cut Marcos free. How does that fit?
Yeah, well, the Philippines actually, what happened in the Philippines is kind of like what happened in Egypt in 2011 with the uprising, which is you have such a groundswell of opposition against the autocrat that the U.S. has supported that U.S. officials start recalculating where their interests would be best served. And in the Philippines, actually, Reagan really wanted to stick with Marcos, and it was only until it looked like just the regime was absolutely doomed and the people power movement was triumphant that Reagan was willing to let go of him. And even after Marcos had lost power, Reagan still, when he was on a trip in the Pacific, he wanted to visit Marcos in exile in Hawaii, which is an idea that his advisors nixed as being really politically unwise. So there's actually a tendency, even though after the fact, it's easy for U.S. officials to say, well, we were on the right side and we promoted democracy. During the process, it's really one of facing the situation where past policy is no longer tenable.
So going back to Egypt then, you look at the 18 days of the uprising and you have Obama saying, Mubarak has to leave power, that you have to have a transition, those sorts of things. Your argument would be that this was simply because with all the people in the streets, they recognized there was no choice.
Yeah, so it's important to be clear on what Obama said that Tuesday night of the uprising, basically 1 week into the uprising, I believe it was February 1st, where he said, orderly transition must begin now. Now, what was the idea of an orderly transition? I argue in the book that orderly transition at that point was Mubarak would actually remain in office until September. He wouldn't run for another term. There would be new elections. And in the meantime, Mubarak would recede into the background and sort of be de jure president, but no longer acting really de facto president. And instead, there would be Omar Suleiman, who would step in being not only vice president, but really kind of the leader of Egypt for that period until September. And then in September, if there had been new elections, Omar Suleiman would have been the front runner to win them. So I discuss at length in the book how much Omar Suleiman was valued in Washington for his support of U.S. intelligence efforts, and he was valued by members of both parties. And so the idea is that there was some recalculation during that first week. If you compare Hillary Clinton saying, we think basically the status quo is sustainable, to Obama saying orderly transition must begin now. But even at that point, they weren't excited about the prospect of letting the opposition in the streets, the opposition in Tahrir, come to power. And just one more point, one of the things that's worth recalling is that there was an opposition proposal on the table for a national salvation government, which would have been civilian-led, would have probably included Mohammed el-Baradei. And that was a proposal that the Obama administration did not embrace. So that's important to think about. what was an orderly transition going to be? It was going to be a sort of controlled elite handover from Mubarak to Suleiman. And it's only when the protests continue and they get a second wind a week later, February 8th, that the Obama administration accepts a less orderly transition and the takeover by the SCAF and the beginning of the transition process that's still ongoing.
Now, fast forward a bit.
Yeah.
Why do you think the United States was so insistent on continuing the election process and the SCAF handing over power and completing the transition? Because it would seem that it would have been very easy for the United States to have simply said, you know what, the Islamists are winning, it's chaos, let's just stick with the SCAF, postpone the elections. Why do you think that didn't happen?
Well, I think there would be a lot of concern about disorder in Egypt or potentially violence or another uprising if you had any disruption of the elections. And I also don't think that U.S. officials are, in general, are especially concerned about Islamists taking power. If you look at U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, actually you can have great U.S. relations with a country that has very traditional religious policies. So much more traditional than what the Muslim Brotherhood espouses. So in that sense, I think it's an ongoing evolution in terms of responding to the situation and kind of minimizing the potential for really radical change.
But if you compare it to, say, Bush with Hamas in 2006, I mean, there's a precedent of the United States kind of backing away when Islamists win. It seems like there's something different there. And I'm trying to get my finger on what you think that is.
Right, yeah. So if you go back, you've got Algeria, and then you've 91, 92, and then you've got the Hamas elections in 2006. Well, in both of those cases, there were appealing alternatives to the electoral victory of the Islamists. So the Algerian junta could remain in control, I think the Bush administration saw in 91, 92, without there being substantial disorder. Obviously, that was a miscalculation. In 2006, you had Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah that could potentially retain control. Also, that didn't turn out so well, leading to the split of the West Bank and Gaza. But then with Egypt, you had this electoral process that seemed to be the best hope for an ongoing transition that would avoid a radical outcome.
So it's really the avoidance of radical outcomes rather than the content of who wins the elections do you think most concerns?
Yeah, I think it's kind of about minimizing uncertainty, minimizing risk.
Do you think this is more so in the Middle East than in other parts of the world? Or, I mean, is this something which is a generic feature of American foreign policy or something which is really about the United States and the Middle East?
I think the stakes in the Middle East tend to be higher, at least during the past several decades, than in other regions. But I think we could see similar patterns during the Cold War if we looked at U.S. policy toward Latin America or the Caribbean, or if we looked at U.S. policy in Southeast Asia during the 60s and 70s.
It's interesting. So last question then. So you're by training and I think disposition a comparativist. And yet you, like Amani Jamal and many others, are moving into this international relations kind of argument. At the same time that many international relations people, such as me, have been becoming increasingly comparative. What do you think that means for the field of kind of political science, Middle East studies? Do you think everybody should be both a comparativist and an international relations person now? Or do you see one trend or kind of one subfield becoming more dominant?
I think the traditional training in subfields will continue, and there's still a role for people to just kind of know their waltz or their scotch-paul and take the exams in those subfields. But I think whenever we have the opportunity, we should read and write and think and talk as if there are not these subfield boundaries. And I think that's what the work that you're talking about is doing, and I think that's very useful. The boundaries do start to look really kind of artificial and counterproductive from those kind of looking in at political science from the outside.
It'll be interesting to see. Where do you publish if you're used to doing comparative pieces and now you're doing mostly international relations arguments? I'm not sure the field is set up for this.
Yeah, well, I guess there's Middle East Channel.
So there's always the Middle East channel. All right. Thank you, Jason Brownlee, University of Texas, Austin, author of Democracy Prevention, the Politics of the U.S. Egyptian Alliance. And thanks for joining us at George Washington University.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.